All right, now it's 11:30. We'll be starting soon. Please take a seat. Thank you everyone for joining us on time for our second workshop. Before Prof. Suen begins her workshop, let me provide some introduction of our distinguished speaker, Prof. Suen. Prof. Suen is an associate professor of inclusive education at Plymouth University. She has previously acted as interim director of Plymouth Institute of Education, associate director of teaching, learning, and internationalization, and also led the BA Education degree. Her specialist areas of teaching, research, and knowledge exchange are disability, special education needs, inclusion, and critical pedagogy. She teaches undergraduate, master's, and PhD students, gives keynotes, and has published widely in special education needs, critical disability studies, and teaching and learning in higher education. The title of the workshop that Prof. Suen is going to be sharing today is, Are We Included? Project Findings and Research Tools. Let's welcome Prof. Suen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So yeah, just to clarify, when this was being opened earlier, there was reference to another title for my presentation. So just to be clear, what I'm presenting with you today is research work and tools that I have used in a multi-method, mixed method, international research project called Are We Included? So very much the question, are we included? So given that you are all working as master's, PhD students and staff doing research at that level, and also given that the theme for today's conference or event is called Impact, Bridging the Gap Between Research and Society. Having been aware of that, I felt how better than to present to you work that I have done that has done exactly that, bridging the gap between research and society. So I'm going to present to you a lot of content this morning about this particular research, Are We Included? A place-based approach to inclusion in the southwest of England. So you'll be getting insight into research tools that we have developed as a part of this international project. I will share with you questionnaire designs that we have used. I will share with you interview schedules that we have used. And I will share with you the relevant outputs from our research project that have led to that impact, that bringing research to society, that bridging the gap, because it's all very good sitting in our ivory towers, doing our reading, doing our research, building our knowledge, doing our publications. But if our work in education, I'm referring here to the discipline of education, from my view, and I know this is a debatable point, but in my view, if our research in education is not resulting in significant outputs that cause impact and changes to the practices, the policies, the realities, the world of education, then from my perspective, I don't see the point. Okay, and that's why I really value today's title, today's theme, which is about impact, bridging the gap between research and society. So I'd really ask you to hang on to that message as we go through my presentation today, because I'm hoping that you'll get a sense of how this research has done exactly that, bridge the gap between research and society, taking the research out to society and bringing society into and getting involved in the research as well. So this particular place-based approach to inclusion, it's an international global study called Are We Included? So are we included? Very much a question. And my work has evolved over the last 15 years in terms of disability rights in higher education and inclusion in mainstream primary and secondary education. The last 5 years, I've been working closely with Professor Umesh Sharma, who's based at Monash University, Professor Sonia Blanford, who was based at Marjon University, and with a number of colleagues who are working at the front line of education across a variety of different cities internationally. So that's teachers, teaching assistants, parents, senior leaders, head teachers, and fundamentally pupils. Okay, so it's very much about those users, those participants being core to the work that we do as a part of this international study. Are we included? So as I mentioned, the last few years I've been working with Professor Umesh Sharma, and he has devised a series of questionnaire schedules that he has used internationally to assess teachers' perceptions of inclusion, teachers' readiness to be inclusive in their work in education. And what we did with this particular strand of the research, it was a UK-based study from an international study, was take those particular questionnaires and apply them in the context of the UK. So let's validate those questionnaires. How might things need to shift or change in the questionnaires to accommodate the UK perspective as practitioners of inclusion? So very much an international study through the Cited network. If you're not familiar with that, those of you involved in education, please do look it up. It's the Consortium for Inclusive and International Teacher Education Development. That's CITED. It's based at Monash University. It's hosted by UMesh, and we have approximately 15 different countries involved in that network, Global North and Global South. And this research around Are We Included is very much presenting to you today the UK strand of this wider international piece of work that's been ongoing for the last, well, UMesh has been doing this for 15 years, really, in terms of the questionnaires and furthering them, developing them on a regular basis. So as I mentioned, this is going to be a multi-method it is a multi-method research project that we have done in the UK, and I'm going to be presenting and giving you examples of some of those methods. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Okay. So in terms of the research design then, and I think I would also ask you please to draw on what we heard from Professor Mark earlier, some really good structure to the nature of research, starting out with key questions, starting out with knowing what it is you want to study, what you want to find out, and then developing a series of methods in order to gather the data, to then do the analysis to come up with your findings. So as we're going through this presentation, please try and think and remember what you heard earlier about the way in which you can structure a research project to make it manageable and come out the other end with realizable content that can be used in practice from the perspective of an education piece of research. So in terms of this research then, as I mentioned, it is an international research project. And it comes from a series of research tools that have been developed through the Cited network, research tools to assess teacher readiness to be inclusive in their practices, research questionnaires to assess pupils' experiences and understandings of their education, and research questionnaires to assess parents' experiences and views on inclusion. So 3 different areas of research we looked at in terms of the questionnaires. So an international study, and what we have with this work, because it's international, is trying to then link and make it relevant to the context of each country, because every country will be different. I mean, if you are practitioners in education, you will be aware that working with your pupils, working with your students, each student is individual, right? Each school community is different. Each teacher is different. We are individuals. So in terms of this particular research then, you have an international study. How are the tools that were used in Australia going to be of relevance to being used in the UK? So we needed to think about, what does inclusion mean in the UK? It means similar issues to inclusion in Australia, and also to inclusion in America, and inclusive education in Russia, and lots of different countries. But it's also very distinctive because of our country's heritage, and nationality and history. And so therefore, it's very important in this international study, with any study that's incorporating a variety of different countries in the data that it collects, to consider the context for each of those sources. So the context for the UK then, we started off as a research team. Umesh, obviously the lead from where the work had evolved from Australia, and then myself and Sonia, our research assistants, fundamental to doing any significant piece of research, and also our connections to school leaders in the southwest of England. And we met with this group of people and we said, okay, we're going to apply these particular questionnaires that have been used internationally to assess teachers' perspectives and readiness to be inclusive, to assess parents' understanding and experiences of inclusion, and also to assess students, pupils' experiences of inclusion. But we need them to be of relevance and context specific to the UK. So the first stage was trying to get an understanding of what inclusion means to us in the UK. So each of the international countries went through similar stages, bringing the research team together at the start to consider the question, what is inclusion in this country, and how does it connect to the bigger questions that this international research study is looking to ask, which is all about teacher readiness, parents' experiences, and pupils' experiences. So this slide is giving you an overview really of what inclusion means in the UK. What are the issues in terms of inclusion in the UK? Now, I've had some very rich conversations with colleagues and students here at Taylor's over the last couple of days. And we will be familiar, and I'm sure you will all be familiar, if you're not, you will be now, that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all definition for inclusive education. So not only does it vary in terms of the international or the national context or the country that you're studying in relation to its inclusive provision, it also varies in terms of the practitioners, the parents, the pupils, and their position on around with regards to inclusion. So from the UK perspective in this study, then we sat down and we discussed what the challenges were for inclusive education. Now, overall, we agreed and signed up to a view that inclusion, I'm just going to jump to the next one. Yeah, this was our definition. We came to that point. This is how we perceived and defined inclusion from the UK strand of the study. And we also used that definition, then we applied it in the place-based study that we did with schools in the Southwest, just to be aware of that. So although it's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all, I think for the purposes of any form of research project, you need to be clear on what it is you are, how you are understanding and defining those key concepts that you're exploring and studying in your research. So this is what we agreed. And obviously the version in Australia was slightly different. The version in America was slightly different. But what we all were talking about in this study in the UK is that it's very much about all children being included in all lessons. Oh. Okay, so going back to the context, to just bring you back then to the UK wing of this study. What is the situation in the UK right now? There's a lot of content on that slide. And I think it really will speak to most of you in the room in terms of what the challenges are with regards to inclusive education right now today. The overarching belief in terms of government policy, in terms of practitioner direction and aims, and also in terms of pupils' experiences, is that inclusive education should be about all children at all times getting access to effective education to enable them to progress and to achieve and to be successful. And we know that there are many groups within our society who, for various reasons, are disadvantaged in terms of that process, or disadvantaged in terms of that journey, experience and come up against various barriers in terms of that journey. So in the UK then, what are those barriers? If we look here at the wider context, that's the UK wider context, and I've noted here 4 key points. social mobility, poverty, disadvantage, and attendance figures. Now, right now in the UK, this is what we are grappling with in terms of effective, inclusive education for all in the UK. Since the pandemic, and I know that this is not just in the UK, I know that there are other countries as well, conversations I had with colleagues here today, that you're also having challenges with attendance in Malaysia. But since the pandemic, we now have approximately a third, depending on the nature of the school, but in some schools we have almost a third of pupils not attending on any given day. And that's a significant jump from the statistic that we would have had before the pandemic. So we are really struggling with attendance. And if pupils aren't attending, well, they can't be included, can they? They can't really experience effective education for success. So attendance is very much an issue, the context in the UK. We need better attendance for inclusive education to happen. We have disadvantage surrounding the COVID pandemic. And again, that's linked to those families who had access to digital technology, who were able to learn online. Not everybody could. And our government did not make, and this is a criticism I have of our government's response to the pandemic at the time, did not make readily available to all families the various technologies that they needed in order to survive. And I use that quite poignantly. It is a strong point to make. But for those young people, they have been so disadvantaged during the pandemic that they now come out of the pandemic and they are so far behind where the rest of their peers are. So how will they now survive coming back into education? For many of them, they're choosing to opt out and not attend. So there's disadvantage. And that disadvantage is arguably linked to the way in which our government did not respond in an ethical and equal way to ensure that everybody had access to the tech that they needed to be able to engage with the learning at home. Poverty is the next context in the UK. We have a significant and rapid growing gap between the haves and the have-nots, between the poor and the rich. Our cost of living crisis. There was a report just recently published by, I think it's Leverhulme, but in this report, it was just 2 weeks ago it was published, they're using the term destitution. Destitution in the UK, that is a term that would have been used when we talked about poverty in Victorian times, where you have 2 or 3 or 4 children sharing one bed to sleep, where you have no heating, no electricity, where you have parents doing 2, 3 different jobs and still not earning enough in order to feed the family. Mothers, fathers, not having 3 meals a day in order to feed their children. And I will send you the link to that report afterwards because it is quite shocking. But I know it's not just the only country that's going through this. There are other countries, so-called developed countries, G7, G8, whatever you want to call them, but so-called developed countries where they are letting their people down and they're not providing the support that they need. So we have this in growing levels of destitution in the UK. And that obviously has an impact then on our desire to be inclusive with regards to our education. And that poverty or destitution, cost of living crisis then also feeds into social mobility. Of course, for effective inclusive education, when it works, the whole point is that it enables our young people to become socially mobile, to progress, to be successful, to have options in life and in their education. And what we have in the UK, in terms of the other points I've just mentioned, is a crisis for many families, and a crisis in particular for those young people with special educational needs and disability. We recently revised our current code of practice and policy at a national level. And what my research is doing is making the argument. We have a publication coming out in a couple of weeks about this. Actually, I'll send it through to you after today. But what my paper is arguing is that what we need to do is have a more place-based approach to interpreting and applying policy. None of this top-down business. It doesn't work. Okay. And there's nothing new in that. This is a point that's been raised over and over again in education over the years. But right now, if we are to move forward and be responsive to these wider context issues and challenges that are having significant impact on inclusive education, we need to contextualize policy. We need to make it relevant to the spaces and places where it's being rolled out. So this paper is coming out and we're hoping to feed it back to government. Some of this research, again, just to make the connection, some of this research has been funded through the government in the UK. We have 3 or 4 different projects related to this study. And we have drawn in funding from our Plymouth City Council, from Devon County Council, from the Office for Students, from Disability Rights UK, and also from the Department for Education. So we have lots of different pots that have all enabled us to carry out this work so that we can be the UK part of this wider international study. It's not always easy when you're trying to get a piece of research off the ground. Where do you find the relevant funding? How do you find a funder that comes from the same ethical position or persuasion or perspective as you do? And how do you then access the money, etc. So what we did with this work was we went knocking on various doors, sending various emails, speaking to various people who were very keen to roll out the research, and we made it happen through a variety of different pots of funding. So that's the wider context. Inclusion in schools, then, what does that actually mean? So just have that in the back of your mind as we're going through. This is the reality of how things are in the UK right now. So what does that mean in relation to inclusion in schools? Now, in terms of inclusive practice and policy in schools, we very much have this divide. And again, there's nothing, I think, UK specific to this. I think that's an international phenomenon, inclusive theory and inclusive practice. And I think that the original theoretical orthodox position of inclusive education is about all children, regardless of need, disability, or particular intersection of identity, being educated together in the same school. That is the idea, that we have all children being educated together, that all children are progressing, that all children are succeeding. And we know that if we were able to implement that idea to full, how amazing would the world be? All young people progressing and getting opportunities. So that's the theory. That's what we are striving towards. That's what policy is trying to make happen. But the practice can be very different in terms of translating policy relating to that theory into practice. And that is my point about the importance of place-based work. And what we find with this study is when we took these abstract theories, we take these abstract theories of inclusion, and we look at them and interpret them in the context of which we're working, which is approximately 19 secondary schools in Plymouth, working with the head teachers, working with the families, listening to their voices and their views, then we as a collective, through this system, through this organisation, through this community and the relevant committees, will devise a particular form of practice that will work in each of the schools. So it's very much, it's connected again, I think, to the work of Stephen Ball. Those of you who are students of education would be familiar with Stephen Ball and Meg Maguire and other authors' work in relation to this. It's about taking abstract policy away from a top down, turning that on its head and saying we need to make this of relevance to our community here. We need to interpret it and have a collaboration within our community to make it work. So Stephen Ball is very much about the democratization of policy. And I believe that what we've done in terms of this work is a really good example of that. So democratizing policy, making it relevant to the place and the context, and as a collective group of practitioners and academics and policymakers working together to apply models of best practice, which I'm going to give you examples of as we go through. So theory and practice divide then, the disconnect between system leaders and school communities. And that's another key point. And we really came up against that actually in this research over the last 2 years. We have a system in the UK now called the academization of schools, which from my perspective is a very neoliberal way of trying to control and contain what the government positions, government only positions, as effective education. And that's not going to be effective for everybody. So I don't see academization as the way forward. With academization, we have a lot of rather abstract CEOs that are based in far-flung destinations. Home might be even in a different country. They are not visiting their school communities. They do not know their staff. They do not know the pupils. They do not know the challenges that each of their individual school communities are facing on a daily basis. To me, that's not good education. That's not inclusive practice, and that needs to change. So disconnect, that's the challenge that schools are facing. silencing of disconnect within minority groups. And of course, if you have minority groups not accessing education, not attending school, well, you're not going to hear their voices, are you? You're not going to understand what their challenges are. We're not going to be able to devise or design a relevant curriculum for their individual needs. So there has been an increasing silencing of minority groups in education in the UK. Also, this focus on standardized assessment achievement, which from my perspective and many of my colleagues and practitioners on the ground is antithetical to truly inclusive practice. If you have, and I can see the image in my head, but if you have an elephant and you have a monkey and you have a human being and you have a baby and you say to them all, okay, I need you to get to the top of the tree. Each of them will need a different tool in order to get them to the top of the tree. So you can't just provide, say, a ladder. That's not going to work for the elephant. It's definitely not going to work for the baby. Yeah. So that's my point. You cannot standardize, nor should you standardize assessment if you're trying to work in inclusive ways to enable all young people to progress at their level and at their speed and pace. The rush to build back better, again, very much tied to the UK focus around levelling up after COVID-19. There was a feeling that, and we were aware of it, many young people were left behind. So they're coming back into schools, many months behind where they should be in terms of their thinking, their metacognition, their abilities to apply new knowledge in key subject areas, maths, literacy, science. So how do we support those young people? How do we bridge that gap? So a lot of emphasis and a lot of funding was put into a variety of different projects. Again, I would argue they were centrally controlled by government and local authorities rather than just given directly to the school communities themselves. And that's when I think another hole in the system had a significant impact in furthering the disconnect and furthering the exclusion for those young people who were already disadvantaged during and before COVID. So who are the children left behind in the UK? Now, many of these groups will speak to you in this room in terms of your familiarity or understanding or awareness of excluded groups in your society. And in terms of this research, just to go back to Professor Mark's presentation earlier, in order to come up with this particular list, we spent a significant amount of time trailing through a variety of papers and resources that was looking at the question, so who are the included groups in UK education? So each of the international countries also undertook this. So every country involved in the study has their own list of who the children are that are being excluded. We refer to the children that are being left behind because we think it's a choice. It is a choice. It's a choice that our government, our society, and our dominant culture has made and continues to make. So the children being left behind in the UK, this is the key list, and it's there quite clearly for you to look through. So it's about children who have special needs disability, children affected by poverty, children that are excluded. Now, these will be young people who, for whatever reason, have been excluded from school temporarily or permanently. So for those young people, the local authority in the UK has got the responsibility to provide them with an alternative form of provision, an alternative form of education, and they don't always get that right. So what happens is that those young people excluded from mainstream education are given access to perhaps a limited timetable, sometime in an alternative provision centre. And the ideal aim, again, thinking about what inclusion is ideally hanging off that theory, what we want inclusion to be, the aim of those alternative forms of provision is to bring those children back into the mainstream again successfully when the time is right for them. And unfortunately, what we're seeing from the data in the UK is that there is an increasing number of young people who do not come back into the mainstream system, and that's getting worse. So missing from excluded children, children missing from local authority schools registers, and that's linked to my colleague has done a very interesting paper on this, Sonia Blanford, on missing children. So there are a significant number of children in the UK who are not registered on local authority registration books. We don't have them on school registration lists. They are missing. School refusal, school avoidance, elected home educated children, ethnic minorities, LGBTQ, homelessness, domestic violence, young carers, armed forces, traveller communities, refugee children, and children in care or children looked after or adopted young children. So that's the list that we came up with through our trawling through the literature with our research assistants. Who are the young people that we are working desperately in many ways to try and include or bring back into the field of education so that they can have a successful experience in their life and in education. So as I said, that's the UK specific context for this international study that we've been involved in. Okay, just jumping back into this again briefly. I just need to check on time. Because I talk a lot once I get started.
1 hour.
Okay, good. Half an hour's gone. Excellent. That's good. Okay, so defining inclusion then. We, after going through all the literature, we then brought it back to the committee. Now, just to clarify what I mean by this committee, this place-based committee. Very much how we did it in the UK, and I know it was done differently. This study has been done differently in different countries internationally. It's an international study, as I mentioned already. But in the UK, we were very keen to look at this question of place-based education, because for us, place-based education is a really good example of Stephen Bowles and others' work around democratic education policy interpretation. So we as a team agreed on this. We have written on it, and there are papers that I will share with you afterwards where you can get access to that work to engage in it further. But we then came up with our own definition of inclusion in this team. So the team included all the head teachers of the secondary schools across Plymouth City, 19, myself and Sonia, who were the principal investigators of the study, Plymouth City Council lead for families and children's services, which includes our education provision. And also we had representation from families in that forum as well. So some parents were invited to be a part of that space. So we met every couple of months, and one of the first meetings we had, and this is very much with the head teachers taking the lead, because they are living with this concept every day. How can they be inclusive? When are they failing to be inclusive? When are they having to let children down because they can no longer resource-wise or otherwise really include those young children? So let's find out what their position is in terms of defining inclusion. So this was the definition we came up with. Now, this definition has subsequently fed into Plymouth City's overarching definitions of inclusion. So all schools across Plymouth City, primary and secondary and alternative provision, all adhere to this definition now of inclusion. Well, that's all really good, isn't it? But ultimately, it's about how you take that definition then and apply it. Okay, and that's what we did next with this research. Okay, so the project, as I said, is a UK study of an international piece of research started off in Monash University. And in terms of then trying to take that definition of inclusion and apply it, we had to get a sense of, well, what do our practitioners, what do our parents, what do our pupils in the city of Plymouth understand and have experience with regards to inclusion? So the first stage of this three-stage study was conducting a series of questionnaires with this population group. And you'll see that the questionnaire stage, we had an excellent response. We had just under 1,500 responses across 10 of the 19 schools. In terms of the data collection. And what I'm going to do now, hopefully if the tech will let me, is give you an example to look at in terms of what the online questionnaires looked like. So they were very much based on psychometric questionnaires, based on assessing practitioners' readiness to be inclusive in their work, parents' understanding and experiences of what inclusive education was, and also pupils' experiences of being included in the school. So 3 strands, 3 questionnaires, and let's hopefully have a look at that now. Yes. So you can see this is just the title. So are we included? Educator perceptions of inclusive education. So each of the titles obviously slightly different. We had pupils' perceptions of inclusive education, and we had parents' perceptions of inclusive education. So these 3 key stakeholders. And again, I hope you're getting the sense, I talked earlier about the need for democratic forms and methods of education research, and our research we as a team set out from the very, very beginning to really apply the way in which we understand and position inclusive education and inclusive education research, which is about making sure that your key stakeholder voices, those who you are trying to develop a practice or a form of research that's going to make a difference to their lives, they need to be involved in terms of the data collection as well. We need to really find out where they stand in terms of these issues. Otherwise, we don't have the data we need to move things forward. So this just brings you through the example that teachers will have received. So just quickly on this one, educator perceptions of inclusive education. So as is, excuse me, always the way with any form of research, obviously you have your ethics to do initially, and that we will have, I'm not looking at that today, but that will have been completed in advance of doing these questionnaire distributions, ethics protocol. And as a part of the ethics protocol, each of our 3 groups of participants will have received an information sheet that will have given them a very clear overview of what the research is about, the fact that it's international, the fact that we're looking at it in the context of the UK, in order to move things forward for more inclusive forms of practice in our local context. So that's the introductory spiel, making it very clear again. And that's just another point I think that will resonate with you all. Whenever we give a survey out to people, it's very important to let them know exactly how long it's going to take to complete. Yeah, I have fallen foul of that many years ago, where I've sent a survey out. I've had really low responses. And I think for one of the reasons was because I hadn't made it clear how long it was going to take. We're all very busy people, and we're living in an increasingly time-starved world and space. And so if you're going to be asking busy practitioners, busy teachers that are juggling 50 things at once, and families, then you need to let them know exactly how much of this valued time you're going to be taking out of their day to complete this important survey. So this is the ethical statement, the statement of consent, which you'll be familiar with in terms of any empirical research that you're doing. You need a statement of consent so that you're able to use the data that you collect. And then if for some reason someone chooses not to complete the survey, well, let's be polite. So thank you. We're sorry that you don't feel you can participate at this time, but thank you for taking the time to read about our research, and you can now close down the survey. So someone may have decided, okay, it's going to take too long for me to do, so they're not able to do it. However, as you've seen from in terms of our responses, we did have a very high response rate. We positioned it, we consider it to be quite a high level of response rates overall. So this is an example of the questionnaires that teachers, educators will have received. So we're trying to get their demographics. So what is their age? What is their gender? How high is their level of qualification? Their current teaching role. So again, we can see the context. How long they've been in the profession. Are they based in, I mean, obviously all of ours were urban metropolitan because we were focused on the city, and also the size of the school. And I just want to jump straight through to the specific questions to assess their readiness to be inclusive. Okay, so attitudes to inclusion scale. Now this is a scale that has been developed through the Cited network, through many academics under the leadership of Umesh and his team. Excuse me. It's a scale that's being widely used by colleagues who work with him as a part of that international network to assess attitudes to inclusion, so practitioners' attitudes to inclusion. So you'll see here, it's a standard Likert scale survey. So again, for those of you in the room thinking about questionnaire designs, if you're looking at doing a multi-method approach where you want to gather some quantitative data as well as qualitative, I always find that Likert scale is a good way in to do that. You can do frequency distribution, you can do t-tests, you can do a variety of other quantitative skills or quantitative analysis from the data. So we have the standard Likert scale. So I believe that all students, regardless of their ability, should be taught in regular classrooms. And you would assume, arguably, that most practitioners, if they perceive themselves as an inclusive practitioner, they're going to probably be around the number 6 or the number 7. We actually had a lot in the number 5 and some in the 4. And I think that also reflected the nature of where practitioners are at in the UK right now. They are exhausted, they are stretched, they are overworked, and they are coping now with trying to help young people pick up on approximately 2 years of having missed education. So there's a feeling that, yes, in the ideal space, in the ideal world, I want to be an inclusive practitioner. We don't have the resources to do it. the school isn't familiar with the level of need with some of these pupils. We need more support. So you get a sense of practitioners are starting to doubt and to question their purpose, and also to doubt and to question inclusive education, which is hard. That was quite an interesting insight. We didn't expect to get as many undecided actually when the results came in. So there we have other statements here. I'm happy to have students who need assistance with the daily activities, etc., etc. So that just goes on through. Unfortunately, I can't share that with you because it is has got copyright in terms of the cited network. So I just wanted you to see an example of one of the 3 questionnaires so you get an idea as to what data we were using, what data we were collecting in the first stage of this 3-stage study. Okay, and again, our study 2 was the interview stage, so gathering the qualitative data. So we were very keen that anyone who'd completed this and was interested in staying involved in the research, and this is just a tip for those of you who are thinking about the tools that you want to develop, if you are keen to recruit for a 2nd stage or a 3rd stage, make sure and get that in at the bottom of your 1st stage tool, whether it's a questionnaire or otherwise, and ask for people to give you the relevant details so that you can have those people to follow on with. So that's excuse me, that's the so study 1. So that was very much a report, and I'm going to just share with you now one of the reports that came back from that study. Yeah, okay. So this was the report from the Teachers Inclusion Climate Scale. So just, I've just put this up because I think it's really important for you just to highlight what I think is a key poignancy in terms of this study and of relevance to what you'll be doing in terms of your own research. That's the nature of the project. So the research project was part of the Plymouth Place-Based School Improvement Project. So what we had in Plymouth at the time was a group of senior executives from the Department for Education and a group of CEOs, i.e. head teachers who have responsibility for a number of schools within the academies that they lead. And they decided, as a part of the levelling up process, as a part of the building back better process, as a part of dealing with the crisis that we had in education at that time after the pandemic, to apply a place-based approach to school improvement, okay? So you're seeing a connection there. We had a place-based approach to the research model that we used and the research that we carried out, which mirrored or reflected what the city was trying to do in Plymouth at that time, which was apply a place-based approach to school improvement, which meant that for the first time, head teachers are happy to share data with each other. And that's, you might think, well, why wouldn't they? Yeah, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't head teachers share data with other schools to help them progress? There's an issue there, there are tensions there, and there's an awful lot of politics involved as well, and challenges in terms of league tables and recruitment and outputs. So up until this point in Plymouth, before the place-based approach to school improvement, many head teachers were not sharing their data with other schools. Ultimately, Ofsted and Plymouth City Council and the lead for schools and families would get access to that data, but other schools wouldn't be able to read it. So they weren't able to share best practice across schools. So we have a head teacher saying, well, we've developed this particular model of provision. Okay, that's really interesting, but why? Well, I can't tell you why, because I can't share with you. I'm not going to share with you the data that's caused us to make this decision to apply this particular model. So that needed to be challenged. So the place-based approach was very much how they decided to crack that nut, as it were. So the priorities, three strategic priorities: school leadership, curriculum, and inclusion. So that's what the place-based approach to school improvement was really focusing in on. And they brought us in after the first year as figures from higher education to work with them in rolling out other related research studies that I've mentioned to you, 3 studies in particular: the questionnaire, the interview, and then the actual intervention program that we did in the schools, which has made significant impact. So this research then aimed to support Plymouth's strategic priority of inclusion and took place between May and August 2022. That was where we collected the data for the questionnaires. And again, some of you who are studying the field of inclusive education and practitioner readiness and practitioner positions around inclusion will be familiar with the work of Avramidis and Norwich 2002, very much about attitudes, studying attitudes. So this research that we did in terms of the questionnaire was another example of assessing attitudes from practitioners, parents and pupils. So really trying to get a sense of how those 3 positions were different, and how do we bring them together so that we are all defining and perceiving and working towards the same goals with regards to inclusion and success. Okay, so I'll show you some examples on study 2 and study 3 in a second, but I just want to take you through some of the questionnaire results that we had in pupils. So study 1 was in the questionnaires. Study 2 was the follow-up interviews. Now, with the interview responses, we had 3 teachers, 3 leaders. Is that okay? Oh. 3 teachers, 3 leaders, 3 students, 3 parents, carers got involved in the interviews. Now, the interviews, we used them as a qualitative form, a qualitative method to further validate the questionnaires and to gain more insight into inclusion in Plymouth. So there's only so much you can gather, you can collect from a Likert scale survey. Yeah, you can see that maybe 40% of teachers believe that they support and want to be and are inclusive. You might get a sense that 70% of teachers are struggling with that, but then it begs the question, why? We want to know the what behind that. We need to get access to that rich data in terms of education in particular, I would say. So it's a mixed method. So the interviews gave us a way into doing that. And I'm just going to show you a copy of the interview schedule that we used. Apologies, I don't actually have it here on the screen. The interview schedule is in another folder, so don't worry, let's jump on to the next one, which is about the student handbook. So the interviews we did with teachers, leaders, students and parents, carers. And what we found from those interviews was a series of questions that arose from the evaluation of the questionnaire data. So again, we had a 2 research assistants working on this project in the UK. We also had a psychometrician, so someone who was well adept at looking at psychometric data and analysing that. And on the basis of our research assistants and our colleague from Cyprus, they designed the subsequent questions to ask for the interviews. So again, very much a staged approach to research, each stage informing the next. And I think that's another key important point to note for those of you engaged or considering doing research and you're thinking, okay, I want to do a questionnaire. I also want to do an interview. Don't jump straight into writing up interview schedules. Have some notes on it, but if you're going to do it in stages, you're going to want to make sure that the first stage, your analysis of the data from the first stage, is informing what you develop and what you design for the second stage and subsequently for the third stage. So it's about making use of that data. Okay, so the other rich point about the follow-up interviews, just to note, is that not only did they further validate the questionnaires, and one of our key questions was how accessible were these questionnaires? How would you edit them or change them? Was anything not clear as you were going through the questionnaires? So we wanted to validate the questionnaires because obviously each country in this international study will have different results, and culturally will respond to some of those terms and words and questions in different ways. So we had a series of findings on that, which was again very interesting. And what also emerged from those interviews were a series of narratives, a series of case studies, a series of stories, families talking about how education was very much challenging their children, how the education system, how they felt it could change, how it could shift. So we drew on the data from the interviews to inform the third stage of the research, which was study 3. And that was the actual 6-week intervention program that we developed in schools. So the questionnaires led to the interviews. The interview data then was also drawn on to help us structure, formulate, put together an intervention program in schools. So what was this intervention program? Let me just show you. So this is the intervention program. Student handbook. So how this program actually worked is we had 6 weeks. We invited the schools that had been involved in the research to be partners in this work. In the first year, we had 6 schools. So we worked with 2 schools in each term of the academic year. And this year, we've managed to access further funding so we can roll it out with a further 6 schools. Linked to the Are We Included intervention is another intervention that I've developed over the last 3 years called Opportunity Plymouth, and that's looking at the question of post-16 inclusion and progression. Of another study, but very much one that I'm happy to share the link to that with you, because I think it will be of interest in relation to what we're hearing about here in relation to the Are We Included research. So this particular intervention then had a series of 6 weeks. Now, who undertook the actual sessions? We trained undergraduate and postgraduate students to become mentors to roll out this actual program in the schools. So the mentors that got involved were from interdisciplinary backgrounds. And I think, again, that point speaks to what we've been discussing already here today about the importance of interdisciplinarity and bringing various disciplines and their strengths together to move new knowledge forward, new design forward, new policy, new practice forward, new theory forward. So my student mentors who decided they wanted to be involved in this work to roll out the intervention with young people in the schools were from a variety of disciplines. We had education, we had psychology, we had medicine, we had health, we had fine art, we had stats, we had gaming. I didn't even know that you could do a degree in gaming, but apparently you can. So from a variety of different disciplines. And they spent approximately a month of online learning and training to become mentors with a physical in-person workshop. And then they worked in groups in each of the schools. So as I said, the first year, the pilot year, we had 6 schools. And in each of those schools, we had 3 mentors working together with approximately 15 young people, including a senior leader from the school, and either myself or Sonia or a research assistant working with the team. So again, very much trying to ensure that clarity and understanding of the program was held all the way through. So very much a leader, a researcher involved in the research, involved and attending each of these sessions in the school, supporting the mentors, supporting the senior leaders, and working with those young people, those pupils. So this was the breakdown of the sessions. So session 1 was very much about ice-breaking, getting to know each other, and looking at the question of positive role models. Now, for this program, the aims for this program is to really work with young people who had experienced significant exclusion and regression in their learning since the pandemic. So that's the relevance. Okay, the relevance is that this intervention was devised for inclusion, devised to support those young people, the list that I referred to earlier. Who are the young people? Who are the missing people? Who are the excluded young people? So we worked with examples from those different groups in the different schools. Sorry, thank you. Okay, yeah. And each week we had a different theme, but ultimately the emphasis on this project was looking at the question of confidence, self-confidence and self-esteem. And we know from the research, and we very much observed it in this work as well, that when a young person feels that they can achieve something, that they feel confident, or when an adult feels confident that they can achieve something or do something, they're coming at it from a strong place. or it's Rosenthal's the theory, the self-fulfilling prophecy theory in a way. So we were very much of the view that these themes, this particular program was about working to build, to regrow, to support those young people with regards to their self-esteem and their self-confidence. So that's a breakdown of the week. So I'm just going to go through the program briefly so you get a sort of sense of how it ran. So some really straightforward sort of icebreakers that you do with young people. So the people that we worked with, the young people we worked with, were at Key Stage 3. Now in the UK, that's years 7, 8, and 9. I think that's similar years to how it's rolled out here in Malaysia in terms of secondary education. So we worked with approximately 15 of them in each school. And they would each come from, within each school, it was a different year group. So we had a year 8 group from one school, a year 7 group from another school. And it was decided to let the school decide who was going to get involved in the program. Again, trying to be place-based about the work, not going into the school and saying, right, we want to work with these 10 pupils from this year group. No, we want you to tell us who you feel would benefit from this program. So then very much deciding who got involved in the project and in this scheme. So that's an example of the first week. And then at the end of each week, the mentors would work with each of the pupils to help them compile some thoughts in terms of what they'd learned and notes for the next week. That's session 2 about aspiration, jobs, career or courses. Session 3, building confidence. Session 4, attainment, the importance of doing your best and how you do that. And finally, communication. What does that actually mean? Now, what I found very interesting was in terms of the language, and I think this is one of the challenges that the practitioners face in the UK, is that we go into our education spaces assuming sometimes, or assuming that young people will understand certain words or certain theories or certain ideas. And what we found with the groups that we were working with in relation to this project was that many of them didn't understand certain terms or certain words, like resilience, for example, or self-esteem. And I think that this is another area of need in terms of inclusive education in the UK. And it's very much about the matter of language development and understanding of language. And that will vary, I think, not just across year groups, but it does vary within each year group. So that was something that we wrote about in terms of our findings. Okay, so those are the three studies, each one informing the next. And I just want to give you an example of some of the stats that we took from the first stage of the research. So the first stage of the research was, just to remind you, was the questionnaire. So we had 3 different questionnaires: questionnaire for parents, questionnaire for teachers, and a questionnaire for pupils. Thank you. Okay, so of the 40% of students that were extremely satisfied or satisfied to a large extent with how included they feel at school, how many of that percentage were actually happy at this school? So some of the statements, some of the questionnaires that we used with the pupils was very much trying to find out what their overall satisfaction was with being included in schools. And what we found was that the majority, as you can see here, the majority of the responses from the students, they were not satisfied. But of the 46 that were satisfied, 52.8% of that 46, so approximately half of that cohort, believed to be happy at this school. So a lot of more finite detail there in terms of further stats, and quite, I think, worrying and quite sad responses. Here, for example, of 46% that were extremely satisfied, only a third of that, or around a third, 28%, feel that they have at least one teacher or adult in school that they can contact if they are facing any difficulties. So that made for interesting interesting data. And then we just have an example here of the 10% that are not at all satisfied with how included they feel at school. And you can see here a significant number of that 10%, as you might expect, do not see this as a truthful statement. I enjoy coming to school every day. So that was the sort of backdrop, that was the sort of reality in terms of pupils' perceptions, experiences of inclusion that our schools were grappling with, working with, before we went in to do the intervention with a particular select group within each school. So in terms of stages 1, again, looking at the questionnaire results, we can see here from the questionnaires in relation to teachers and leaders, they have a very clear lack of confidence that they've shared in around these areas here. Now we know, excuse me, we know that all of these particular aspects of teaching practice are fundamental to get right if we're going to be inclusive in terms of our work, if we're going to be effective in terms of enabling those young people to progress and to succeed and to move forward. And yet a significant number of colleagues, teachers, educators, were rating their confidence as particularly low in these areas. So getting involved with parents and carers. We talk about in the UK hard to reach parents. And I find that language-wise, I find it quite challenging, because to me, it implies that the parents are choosing to be hard to reach. And we know from the research that in many cases, these are parents who have struggled with education themselves and are also struggling in terms of the post-COVID situation and in terms of poverty. So they're not choosing necessarily to be hard to reach. It is their situation, their circumstances. So what can we do as a society? What can we do as a school community to reach out to those parents and engage with them? Adapting teaching strategy to support a student who is failing or becoming disaffected. Again, low confidence in controlling or calming disruptive behaviour. Low confidence in using a variety of assessment techniques, and even lower confidence still in terms of dealing with physically aggressive students in the classroom or collaborating with other professionals. So this all came from our questionnaire results. And it made for some very interesting reading, which then fed into subsequent interview schedules that we devised with the teachers. And this is what we see here from teachers and leaders in terms of barriers that they see as currently hindering inclusion in their classroom. And for the majority, they feel it's to do with the lack of teaching assistant support. Other barriers included student attendance, which we know is an ongoing increasing challenge, lack of flexibility in school behaviour policies, physical limitations of buildings and facilities, and a lack of funding and a culture of internal exclusion. So the follow-up interviews that we did in study 2, as mentioned earlier, 3 teachers, 4 leaders, 3 students, 3 parents, carers. And they were to further validate the questionnaire and also to inform study 3. So I've talked you through what we did in study 3. So the interviews gave us additional data to help us devise and design that particular mentoring program. It also gave us further insight into inclusion in Plymouth. So we heard about exceptional practices in certain school communities around inclusion, very proactive and passionate teachers. But we also were able to find out and hear about systemic issues and sort of challenges that seem to be across the board for schools in the city around providing effective inclusive education. So the themes that emerged from our follow-up interviews are the following. Stories of exceptional practice, more that we can do. Behaviour is a real challenge. Importance of positive relationships. Teacher and SENCO collaboration. Parental involvement. Attendance. Systems and collaboration. Extracurricular activity. Systemic issues. Now, what we found was very poignant in terms of these emerging themes is that they were feeding back to the literature that we had first gathered at the beginning of the study, trying to understand the context with regards to inclusion in the UK. What is the reality of effective inclusive education in the UK? What works, what doesn't work, what are the challenges? And what we found from our analysis of the questionnaires and our subsequent analysis of the interview data was a series of themes that very much spoke to that literature. So there's the frustration then is, we know this is the reality. We know this is what our country are struggling with in terms of being inclusive. What are we doing about it? How can we move it forward? And I think there are a number of barriers that for me are very clear as to why things aren't moving forward. And one is culture. Second one is to do with resources. And the third one is to do with location. So what is the method of education we should be doing? Who's deciding on that method? And if that location is coming from the top down, from a central government, there's not a sense of understanding what the relevant contextual need is in the individual city or school. So the study 3, I've given you the example. We've looked at the handbook already. And it's a series of 1-hour sessions over 6 weeks. And the aim is very much about improving confidence and self-esteem. And with the aim that will then lead to better attendance and better achievement. So I've talked you through how we developed and delivered those sessions. And what did we find? Okay. Okay, so this is the evaluation report from study 3, the first of our 3 terms of study 3 last year. So we were in 2 schools in each term. So this is study 3, the first 2 schools that we worked with. And that was Heels School and Lipsum School. Again, very much our particular definition of inclusion, informing the work, and being referred to again in the report. And some very strong citations there from staff within the school as to how they felt the programme had impacted on some of the young people in their school. To witness our students change from being so hesitant and wary at first to becoming confident enough to share their opinions with peers and on the written page was a joy. So again, notion of progression being observed. I think key summary at the end. Yeah, so what we found then was very much that there were some limitations in terms of the study. And the data should not be taken in isolation. So there are many sociocultural factors that affect the progress of children and young people with regards to attainment, attendance and behaviour. At one of the 2 schools in particular, students were selected citing their recent downward spiral in behaviour and commitment to learning. In this light, even maintaining progress in attainment, attendance, attitude and inclusion can be seen to be positive. So there may not be significant progress, but if we're able to keep a stable line in terms of attendance and attainment, that can also be seen as positive. So that the work continued on, and we rolled it out with 4 other schools last academic year. And our findings, this is the key summary of the findings. They're not in the report, so they're here. So the key findings from the study, the 3rd study, was that students were reporting an increased feelings of inclusion amongst their peers. There was an improvement in behaviour, independent learning and quality of work. School staff report increased confidence and self-esteem, and an increasing number of parents reported that students enjoyed attending school, enjoyed lessons and looking forward to classroom activities. Parents had improved their satisfaction of the school's inclusion agenda. School staff had greater reflexivity around inclusion, And what we also found was that there was much happening in terms of conversations in the staff room and in the classroom across teachers about inclusion and positivity of making that work. And here we have a couple of photos of some of the kids that have come along to the end of year celebration on campus, and some info in terms of what's next for our work. So as I've said already, we have received some further funding to roll out more interventions in schools. And we've also been invited to be a part of another international study through the Cited Network, looking at parents' decisions and why parents decide in some cases for their children to go to a special school, and in other cases for their child with disability to go to a mainstream. So we're now involved in a further study internationally on this work. And I think that's the other key point just to highlight and pull out in terms of this work. With any research, you'll have your findings, you'll get your outputs, you'll have your interventions perhaps in some of those outputs, but you will also be left with more questions, new questions that will arise from your work. You'll also be left with limitations that you might be disappointed in terms of the study. You didn't think that it was going to, or it didn't deliver in one area that you hoped that it would deliver, whatever that might be. And it's important to capture that as well, to keep a sense of what the limitations were, how you might do it differently if you were doing it again. But then also, what are the new questions that it has developed in terms of the study. So the next stage then will be a further round of interventions in schools next year, and also getting involved in this second international study around the global question of parental choice with regards to inclusive education. Is it a choice to go to special school or preference to go to mainstream? What are the issues in terms of determining that decision? And we have a range of various publications as well. So that's the work that we've been doing in the Southwest. Are we included? I think it's a very important question that we need to continue asking internationally as well as nationally in our different countries. And I think that we have a long way still to go in order to enable that form of successful inclusive education to happen for every child in the UK. And this is just one example of a model that seems to be working for those young people who get the opportunity to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Suen, for the informative session. I'd like to confirm with the floor if there are any questions for Prof. Suen.
Yes.
Okay, Professor, I'm a PhD student from Taylor's University conducting a study on inclusive education. She's planning to use VR technology to stimulate the sensory experience of students with autism, aiming to enhance teachers' understanding and empathy towards them. She was fortunate to hear your insights today and was wondering if you have any academic groups focused on inclusive education that she can join. This would be greatly help her to stay updated on the current research trends. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can I just could you just say that last bit again? That would help her
to have some academic groups to focus on the inclusive education. Thank you.
I think most countries, or the countries that we've worked with in terms of the cited work, will have networks for parents, will have networks for pupils, will have networks for practitioners. So I think if what this student is looking to get is access to the real lived experience of practitioners, teachers, of parents, of families, then she will need to be looking to get access to those particular focus groups, those particular networks, which will be found online. However, I think it's also important that at that level she's involved in academic networks. So networks like, for example, the British Education Research Association, the European Education Research Association. There's a global inclusive education network as well. So I think the more networks that she's able to get herself involved in, the better. But she needs to think about that question. What knowledge is she wanting to access? Is it purely academic knowledge, or is it about getting insight into the real lived experience of applying inclusive education on the ground? And I think probably it's a bit of a mix of all of those forums really is what she probably wants to connect with.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
We have a question here from Zoom. What findings from this project do you consider to be unique to the UK setting? And are there patterns that you believe are similar in different regions such as Malaysia?
Okay, that's a really good question. And those two good questions. So in terms of unique to the UK setting, well, you will have heard me speak earlier about relevant legislation that we have in the UK called Levelling Up, Catch-up Learning. That's UK specific work, UK specific legislation. But where there is a similarity is that I think you'll find that an awful lot of countries are also rolling out similar policies and similar resources and similar priorities. Because I think it's quite clear from the research, and I know it's the situation in Malaysia too, from conversations I've had with colleagues here, that we have regressed in terms of academic progression for young people over the pandemic. And it is the usual suspects, those particular minority groups, that have suffered the most. And in the more, I think, progressive countries and or progressive communities within those countries, they are looking to make change happen from within its relevant context. So that notion of place-based work, again, which this study was very much about. So place-based interventions, place-based analysis of practitioners, parents and young people. And I think that's a message, I think, that's going to be of relevance to many countries in terms of working out how to move forward after this pandemic and the long-term and ongoing impact it's had in relation to academic achievement and inclusive education. So I think the uniqueness with regards to the UK is very much related to the way in which we have developed, effectively or not, government policy. And then I think there are similarities. And I think going back to one of the first slides that I spoke to earlier, the children that are left behind, those particular groups, those particular minority groups, I think you see that in most developed countries, and it will be a similar situation in Malaysia as well. Okay.
Thank you, Prof. Suen. I would like to invite you to the right side of the room.
Okay. Yeah.
I'd like to invite Prof. Mustafa to present a token of appreciation to Prof. Suen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you once again, Prof. Suen, and thank you, Prof. Mustafa. Now, for the time that we're all waiting for, it's time for lunch. We'll be starting our next and last workshop at 2:30. Do have a good lunch, and we will be seeing each other back here at C604 and also on Zoom slightly before 2:30. Thank you.